This week I published a piece called How to Commit Suicide, and I hope that you would get the idea that it's not supposed to encourage you to commit suicide, but in fact to discourage. But it's one of the most important questions in philosophy, isn't it? That why live? What's the point of life? What's the point of anything? And if you go into philosophy, you'll find a series of philosophers trying to answer this question. The question of life and death, the question of suicide. It's very interesting that although almost no philosopher would advise you to do that, there are so many of them that would find it extremely difficult to condemn it. Intellectually. And that's where it becomes very interesting. It's interesting because it has a huge significance, that of life and death. But at times the question does seem absurd, especially when you talk to somebody about it, because it's very hard to talk about meaning outside the religious parameters. So it's an interesting side of philosophy which we must read and explore a bit more, because this is something we all face. This is something the humanity is going to face, especially with the downfall of religions. How the people are going to find meaning in their lives, how they're going to live without any idea of God. And I guess philosophy can come to our rescue in that case. So I will talk about a lot of philosophers and their ideas on life and death, but that's for future. Today I'm just going to touch upon the work of Albert Camus, and specifically his book called The Myth of Sisyphus, where he tries to answer these questions, the question of meaning. So I'm going to read from the first part of his book, and it's called Absurdity and Suicide. Let's read. There is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. Judging whether life is or is not worth living amounts to answering the fundamental question of philosophy. All the rest, whether or not the world has 3 dimensions, whether the mind has 9 or 12 categories, comes afterwards. These are games one must first answer. And if it is true, as Nietzsche claims, that a philosopher, to deserve our respect, must preach by example, you can appreciate the importance of that reply, for it will precede the definitive act. These are facts the heart can feel, yet they call for careful study before they become clear to the intellect. If I ask myself how to judge this question is more urgent than that, I reply that one judges by the action it entails. I've never seen anyone die for the ontological argument. Galileo, who held a scientific truth of great importance, abjured it with the greatest ease as soon as it endangered his life. In a certain sense, he did right. That truth was not worth the stake. Whether the earth or the sun revolves around the other is a matter of profound indifference. To tell the truth, it is a futile question. On the other hand, I see many people die because they judge that life is not worth living. I see others paradoxically getting killed for the ideas or illusions that give them a reason for living. And what is called a reason for living is also an excellent reason for dying. I therefore conclude that the meaning of life is the most urgent of questions. How to answer it? On all essential problems, there are probably but two methods of thought. The method of La Police and the method of Don Quixote. Solely the balance between evidence and lyricism can allow us to achieve simultaneously emotion and lucidity. In a subject at once so humble and so heavy with emotion, the learned and classical dialectic must yield, one can see, to a more modest attitude of mind deriving at one and the same time from common sense and understanding. Suicide has never been dealt with except as a social phenomenon. On the contrary, we are concerned here at the outset with the relationship between individual thought and suicide. An act like this is prepared within the silence of the heart, as is a great work of art. The man himself is ignorant of it. One evening he pulls the trigger or jumps. Of an apartment building manager who had killed himself, I was told that he had lost his daughter 5 years before, that he had changed greatly since, and that experience had undermined him. A more exact word cannot be imagined. Beginning to think is beginning to be undermined. Society has but little connection with such beginnings. The worm is in man's heart. That is where it must be sought. One must follow and understand this fatal game that leads from lucidity in the face of existence to flight from light. There are many causes for a suicide, and generally the most obvious ones were not the most powerful. Rarely is suicide committed through reflection. What sets off the crisis is almost always unverifiable. Newspapers often speak of personal sorrows or of incurable illness. These explanations are plausible, but one would have to know whether a friend of the desperate man had not that very day addressed him indifferently. He is the guilty one, for that is enough to precipitate all the rancors and all the boredom still in suspension. But if it has to fix the precise instant, the subtle step when the mind opted for death, it is easier to deduce from the act itself the consequences it implies. In a sense, and as in melodrama, killing yourself amounts to confessing. It is confessing that life is too much for you or that you do not understand it. Let's not go too far in such analogies, however, but rather return to everyday words. It is merely confessing that is not worth the trouble. Living naturally is never easy. You continue making the gestures commanded by existence for many reasons, the first of which is habit. Dying voluntarily implies that you have recognized, even instinctively, the ridiculous character of that habit. The absence of any profound reason for living, the insane character of that daily agitation, and the uselessness of suffering. What then is that incalculable feeling that deprives the mind of the sleep necessary to life. A world that can be explained even with bad reasons is a familiar world. But on the other hand, in a universe suddenly divested of illusions and lights, man feels an alien, a stranger. His exile is without remedy, since he is deprived of the memory of a lost home or the hope of a promised land. This divorce between man and his life, the actor and his setting, is properly the feeling of absurdity. All healthy men having thought of their own suicide, it can be seen without further explanation that there is a direct connection between this feeling and the longing for death. The subject of this essay is precisely this relationship between the absurd and suicide. The exact degree to which suicide is a solution to the absurd. The principle can be established that for a man who does not cheat, what he believes to be true must determine his action. Belief in the absurdity of existence must then dictate his conduct. It is legitimate to wonder clearly and without false pathos whether a conclusion of this importance requires forsaking as rapidly as possible an incomprehensible condition. I am speaking, of course, of men inclined to be in harmony with themselves. Stated clearly, this problem may seem both simple and insoluble, but it is wrongly assumed that simple questions involve answers that are no less simple, and that evidence implies evidence. A priori, and reversing the terms of the problem, just as one does or does not kill oneself, it seems that there are but two philosophical solutions, either yes or no. That would be too easy. But allowance must be made for those who, without concluding, continue questioning. Here I am only slightly indulging in irony. This is the majority. I notice also that those who answer no act as if they thought yes. As a matter of fact, if I accept the Nietzschean criteria, they think yes in one way or another. On the other hand, it often happens that those who commit suicide were assured of the meaning of life. These contradictions are constant. It may even be said that they have never been so keen as on this point, where, on the contrary, logic seems so desirable. It is a commonplace to compare philosophical theories and the behavior of those who profess them. But it must be said that of the thinkers who refuse to have a meaning of life, none except Kirillov, who belongs to literature. Peregrinos, who is torn of legend, and Jules Lequer, who belongs to hypothesis, admitted his logic to the point of refusing that life. Schopenhauer is often cited as a fit subject for laughter because he praised suicide while seated at a well-set table. There is no subject for joking. That way of not taking the tragic seriously is not so grievous, but it helps to judge a man. In the face of such contradictions and obscurities, must we conclude that there is no relationship between the opinion one has about life and the act one commits to leave it? Let us not exaggerate in this direction. In a man's attachment to life, there is something stronger than all the ills in the world. The body's judgment is as good as the mind's, and the body shrinks from annihilation. We get into the habit of living before acquiring the habit of thinking. In that race which daily hastens us toward death, the body maintains its irreparable lead. In short, the essence of that contradiction lies in what I shall call the act of eluding, because it is both less and more than diversion in the Pascalian sense. Eluding is the invariable eluding because it is The typical act, the fatal evasion that constitutes the third theme of this essay, hope. Hope of another life one must deserve, or trickery of those who live not for life itself but for some great idea that will transcend it, refine it, give it a meaning, and betray it. And thus, everything contributes to spreading confusion. And it has not been wasted effort. People have played on words and pretended to believe that refusing to grant a meaning to life necessarily leads to declaring that it is not worth living. In truth, there is no necessary common measure between these two judgments. One merely has to refuse to be misled by the confusions, divorces, and inconsistencies previously pointed out. One must brush everything aside and go straight to the real problem. One kills oneself because life is not worth living. That is certainly a truth, yet an unfruitful one because it is a truism. But does that insult to existence, that flat denial in which it is plunged, come from the fact that it has no meaning? Does its absurdity require one to escape it through hope or suicide? This is one must clarify, hunt down, and elucidate while brushing aside all the rest. Does the absurd dictate death? This problem must be given priority over others, outside all methods of thought and all exercises of the disinterested mind. Shades of meaning, contradictions, the psychology that an objective mind can always introduce into all problems have no place in this pursuit and this passion. It calls simply for an unjust, in other words, logical thought. That is not easy. It is always easy to be logical. It is almost impossible to be logical to the bitter end. Men who die by their own hand consequently follow to its conclusion their emotional inclination. Reflection on suicide gives me an opportunity to raise the only problem to interest me. Is there a logic to the point of death? I cannot know unless I pursue, without reckless passion, in the sole light of evidence, the reasoning of which I am here suggesting the source. This is what I call an absurd reasoning. Many have begun it. I do not yet know whether or not they kept to it.